now discussing with Terry Anker, an Indiana businessman. Is the new normal the old normal? And let me welcome Terry Anker from Indiana, and in the United States, Indianapolis, actually, where he's based. Terry is a serial entrepreneur. He's a legal scholar by training, also a lawyer, is sitting on a whole bunch of boards, and of course, has been with the Free Market Roadshow many times. He's also spent time with us in Romania. And I would also like to thank our partners, the American University in Romania and the Ayn Rand Institute in Romania, without whom this program today were not possible. My name is Barbara Kolm. I direct the Free Market Roadshow, and it's my privilege to hand over to Terry Anker in the United States, who will discuss whether this is the new normal. Terry, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Dr. Colm. It's always wonderful to be with you. I wish that we were greeting each other face to face in this remarkable time. It's especially important, I think, that we connect as humans. Greetings to all of our listeners this morning from the United States, where it's Mother's Day. It just is about 8:40 in the morning. And after I finish this presentation, I'll be going to make breakfast in bed for my lovely wife and the mother of our two sons. So forgive me if I'm a bit distracted this morning. But with that, let me see if I can use this technology and bring us up on a shared screen. There we are. There, can you see me?
Perfect. Yes, all well.
Outstanding. Well, as you mentioned, Barbara, today we're talking about disruptive innovation, and a really remarkable theme for the Roadshow, as there have been over the many, many years that I've been involved. And what does that really mean? Well, as a business person, as an entrepreneur, the first thing that you consider anytime that there's a particular threat is that you sit back and imagine what is the impact of what's happening in the economy. So what are the possible threats of the corona measures after the pandemic? Well, when you read the newspapers or watch the media, or certainly if you surf the web at all, you discover that there are imagined threats to world order. There's threats of war. There are threats of starvation. There's threats to the polar ice caps. There are threats to religion or atheism, and there are threats to money or the financial system. Billions of human lives are threatened. The social order is threatened. Even the planet is threatened. So in other words, if there's not an opportunity here as a business person or as a government leader, you're probably not paying much attention. That said, so George Washington, a famous American that many of you know, said in a free republican government, you cannot restrain the voice of the multitude. So that raises the question, of course, to business or to government, what is the voice? And can that voice be summoned? If it can be summoned, can it be managed or curtailed? And so what is a crisis? We look at this notion of crisis, which has been the hallmark of our discussion for these, at least 3 months. You and I were talking before the broadcast. It's been even months before that, likely. But what are our crises? We've had financial crises. We've had migration crises. We've had melting ice caps. We've had global warming. We've had fire and all sorts of crises. Well, what's happened in the past? If we're going to imagine the future, we have to imagine how we've managed crisis in the past. How do we proceed? Well, one of our many business interests is 11 newspapers. And I'll tell you, as someone in the media business, web hits on newspapers, and we, along with others like the New York Times, have been working to find a way to make internet hits profitable. But right now, during this pandemic, web hits on newspapers and other media sites are at record highs. Pushing out information is attracting viewers, which ultimately will attract advertisers. Benjamin Franklin, another American, once said, either write something worth reading or do something worth writing. The real challenge here in this notion of threats of coronavirus is that we're going to continue to write and push out information that people want to read. Now, whether it's worth writing or not is an entirely different question, and I think something that our viewers will continue to contemplate. So how do political leaderships respond to a crisis? There's a statement, that never let a good crisis go unutilized. And it's been attributed to many of these different men: Winston Churchill, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, Machiavelli, Even Saul Alinsky, the author of Rules for Radicals, which President Obama of the United States would cite occasionally about how to disrupt societies. And his minion, the would-be and ultimately mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, talked a great deal about how to use a crisis to correct what they believe to be failures in the market, whether that's global warming or social injustice or inequality. It's difficult to know because the attribution is not honest. It's probably not likely that Churchill said it or any of the others did, but they often referred to this notion that during a time of disruption, people are more receptive to a new order, whatever that order might be. And so the point that I think I'm making as a business person is that there are many of us right now that are trying to figure out how this will play out and how we gain advantage. Likewise, many world governments are doing the exact same thing. How will this play out? The world is disrupted. How do we come in a subsequent to disruption world and be in a better position than we were in before the disruption? With that, right now, there are countless countries, millions, billions of people on lockdown. It's interesting because the red on this map show that they are on complete lockdown. The yellow means partial lockdown. Many of the countries in gray you can see are countries that are in lockdown in a de facto way now, even though they don't or didn't respond to the coronavirus. They were locked down previously. There weren't many people going to North Korea, for example. So what does this mean? It means that government officials have made countless decisions to prove the counterfactual. The counterfactual, of course, is proving that because I did something, something else did not happen. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to prove. Any attorney will tell you that proving that your action prevented the action of another can be very, very difficult. And now governments have trapped themselves in this notion that they must prove that their action prevented something worse than what their action actually did. Now, think about that for a second. You have taken an action that you must now prove was better in the harm that it caused than the action that would have happened but for your intervention. It's an extremely difficult thing to accomplish legally, and it's an extremely difficult thing to accomplish in reality. The virus is to blame for the bad, or so might say some. And now the real battle is going to be able to figure out who gets credit for the good. Well, many would say that a closed state compared to an open state, it lines up in these ways. There are fewer deaths versus more deaths. There are lower emissions versus more emissions. There are fewer crimes versus more crimes. There's less consumption versus more consumption. There's less lower pregnancy versus more pregnancy. By the way, that's an interesting one. Many people assume that birth rates would go up during a pandemic because people are home. Well, the truth is that responsible people who are staying at home are not having any more children than they were before. So what's happening is you're seeing the irresponsible people are having more because they're not going to work. It's a very interesting paradox. And you go on, there'll be less war, but in fact, that there will be more conflicts if we have an open society because people are seeing each other. There'll be less disease in a closed society and more disease in an open society. Well, at the end of the day, one thing that I do agree with, because I don't think any of us can possibly agree with that in a writ blanc way, is that there are more experts in a closed society. Well, truly there aren't. As the society closes, we narrow down to a handful of experts. We quiet the voices of thousands. On the other side, the argument is that there are less experts in an open society. Completely false. The fact that we can speak today shows that there's more opportunity for more voices. So what happens? We're all in this together is a hallmark of nations around the world now. We're all in this together. But the truth is, as Orwell said, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. In an earlier broadcast on this roadshow, others have spoken at great length about the disparate impact on individuals and how the most vulnerable in many cases are suffering the most. So in a new normal, what does a new normal mean? Well, I quote here Milton, or what will happen. Government will regulate to attempt to prove their decisions and hide failures. Government will regulate. This is not what we are imagining will happen. This is what's happened each time in the past. Government will regulate to attempt to prove their decisions and hide their failures. It's happened in the US, it's happened in the EU, it's happened around the world. It's very difficult for government to admit failure You lose elections through failure. Business will attempt to gain advantage in competitive markets as it does. Unfortunately, some will use government as necessary to advantage themselves. They'll seek regulation, especially large businesses, will create anti competitive desires against smaller businesses. And factions will push agendas seeking advantage in what's claimed to be a new normal. Well, it's interesting because when I put this presentation together, there's nothing new about it. This is exactly the same normal that's existed among humanity since the very beginning. These kinds of arguments could be discussed in ancient Rome or in Egypt in the early days. So, what will happen with nation states? Nation states will borrow to avoid pain. They don't want to recognize that. Nations will blame to avoid responsibility because they can't be held accountable for their own actions, whatever they are. Either they were too aggressive or not aggressive enough. And nations will become suspicious and isolated to prove dedication to sovereignty. But truly, the isolation is the result of some desire to prevent a shared experience or a free market. So, with that, how are creativity and freedom making a better world? If you have special interest in looming government, you've got enormous city states that are fighting back, you have nations that are invariably going to defend their actions against others, the finger pointing will begin. How do we address it? Well, we address it through disruptive innovation. The only solution for what's happened in the past, the only solution for what will happen in the future. Human beings have not changed that much in thousands of years. The arguments that we evolve quickly are simply not supported by science. But disruptive innovation promotes creativity. It promotes and supports innovation. It helps us demand freedom. Creativity cannot exist in a place where freedom is not enhanced or allowed. It urges us to calculate and measure and then assume risk. As an entrepreneur, I'm often maligned by individuals who say, "Wow, you entrepreneurs like risk. You seek risk." That's not the case at all. What entrepreneurs do is we measure and calculate and think about risk, and we compare it to the offsetting upside of our actions. But if we are prevented by government or anyone from assuming risk, we are prevented from moving. We're locked into the caste that we're in, unable to advantage ourselves by our wit or our ability or our willingness to work or our willingness to take risk. We should ask questions if we hope to be disruptive. Question everything. I can speak as someone who owns newspapers. We have our own messages. CNN, Fox News, everyone carries their own message, even the BBC. And we must question what it is that we're being told. Engage in the public space. The fact that you're watching this video today suggests that you're already in a position that's far superior to many of your peers, in that you're willing to at least contemplate what's being said. And then finally, and I think most importantly, expect better. Certainly, we're going to be exposed by this. We'll be exposed by a countless myriad of things that we've yet to contemplate. And yet each day we should arise and expect better than the day before. The idea that we will lock ourselves in our home and stand in a state of stasis is not a responsible move for any human being. We must always work and strive to improve ourselves and find new and innovative ways to continue to move forward, knowing all along that the new normal is not the new normal at all. It's exactly the way that humans have behaved countless times. Look to history, read, educate ourselves, figure out what's happened in the past, and we can begin to predict what government and business and other leaders will do in order to advantage themselves at the end of this disruptive period. Finally, I'll go to one of my favorite quotes. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaucrats. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. And it goes on. It's Milton Friedman, a Nobel laureate, speaking to an American talk show host in the late 70s. So that the record of history is absolutely clear, there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system. And I would argue by free thought, by free human beings. It is individuals who advantage us, not a government bureaucracy. And the greatest fear that I think we should have going through this is who will seize power after the disruption settles. The final thing that Friedman said in another speech, the Great Depression, and he was referring to a significant economic depression in the United States that was, in fact, global. The Great Depression, like most other periods of severe unemployment, was produced by government mismanagement rather than the inherent instability of the private economy. I think it's impossible for us to imagine any circumstance where any government would stand forward and take responsibility for its actions on the downside. Certainly, they'll claim responsibility for all good things in attempting to prove the counterfactual. But we as citizens have to continue to challenge, as we always have, those suppositions. Thank you, Barbara.
Well, thank you very much. This was definitely a tour de raison that you did, combining the theory and practice. I would like to add one more point in theory, namely, you mentioned individuals think and act, societies per se, as Hayek said in his methodological individualism don't. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that it's up to us to take responsible action and bear the consequences.
You couldn't be more right. And I think that all actors, as we pointed to, whether it's Mark Twain or Machiavelli or Winston Churchill or Sal Alinsky, they understand that chaos produces an opportunity to silence the voices of individuals. Great individuals will rise and they'll claim ground while the masses are silenced. Perhaps we can say on the downside, Hitler and others, countless others.
Before going to the first questions that are popping up, I would also like to mention one great individual in the United States who, when in times of crisis, actually as a politician did not intervene. It was Ronald Reagan, and he completely said, "Okay, let." Of course, it was it were different crises. It was not a health crisis, but he said, "I don't want to intervene." What is your take? Would Ronald Reagan have intervened these days or not?
Sure. The first thing that I might challenge, if you forgive me, the supposition that he took no action.
Yeah.
Political leaders are enamored with the notion that they take action. I've taken this action. I've done this thing. I think Reagan's inaction was a specific and intentional action. Restraint is a virtue. The notion that one will restrain their behaviors is a virtue. And so this notion that Reagan would not have acted or might have been restrained or would have taken great action, I think is one that has come up in the United States many, many times. The truth is Reagan would have acted as he did as president of the United States with tremendous restraint. So this period of time, there are examples, and there will be examples of people who recovered differently, perhaps better, perhaps worse, but they were more restrained. In the US, we have a sort of an interesting system now where the president has allowed the individual governors of states to be competitive with each other in the way that we were set up originally. And it will be interesting to me to see how states will recover. Will certain states that were less or more active recover more or less quickly? Interestingly enough, Republican states in the US have a lower infection rate than Democrat states. Some would argue that's because urban areas are there, and that makes sense. That may be. It also may be that it's a nature of the way that Republican governors are reacted, or maybe it's the way that Democrat governors are reacted. It's impossible to know until we have years of study.
Yeah, we have one of those questions actually refers to that. It will be the next one that I will take after Mircea's question, who asks, should we expect that that nationalism movement and protectionism will gain some ground and the economic globalism will shake a little in the aftermath of the crisis?
I would point to World War One. What happened in the aftermath of World War One? We saw nationalism on the rise. It leads to some very concerning things. Fear is a way to drive individual human beings into irrational behavior. And I can't begin to imagine that we won't see some rise of nationalist movements. Certainly protectionism. We're seeing in the United States now, for example, a rising voice of anti-internationalism. Certainly regarding the Far East, China, and it's concerning. Is there a solution to global problems that comes through nationalism? Probably not.
Well, I have another question that I was referring to with the to before when you were mentioning the state competition, and this is by Muhammad, and he says, how long will it take to recover from coronavirus economic crisis? So,
Sure, I am a bit more optimistic, but many entrepreneurs are, I suppose. It's not my personal belief that uh, the businesses that have high cash value that are producing value won't be able to recover from this within 6 months to a year. The real challenge is whether or not we continue this sort of almost suicidal drive that we have towards fear and restriction on our own behaviors. Uh, that has I'm much more concerned about that kind of withdrawing that comes out of fear than I am about some fragile economic system that's not currently working. The underlying problems in the economy, debt, out of control spending, those kinds of things have been exacerbated greatly. But coronavirus itself is not particularly destructive. It's government ongoing decisions that concern me tremendously.
let me follow up on that. I mean, we have the issue of globalization, globalism versus protectionism on the one hand, and having seen what has happened in the United States with your president in the past, who was very protectionist on the one hand, but on the other hand, we've seen now the production chains totally dry up.
Right.
And so, what I mean, how long will it take until we will pick up speed? And not only on the production side, but you as a brewer, or at least owning a brewery, you deliver to restaurants and bars in Europe. Many of those are still closed until the end of next week. So, which section of the or branch of the economy will be hit most, and which less? What is your take on that?
Well, I'm certain that service industries are being decimated in the short term.
Mhm.
People are unwilling to go out. People are changing their habits. Common uh, sense dictates that people can change a habit in 6 weeks. Well, we've been in lockdown for more than 6 weeks. People have begun to change the way that they operate. That
Mhm.
said, in our own companies, we've had we've had one that we've decided to cease operations. But to be honest, it wasn't uh, uh, something that was particularly going to be viable in an ongoing way. The way it was difficult. We've got a
Mhm.
number of other companies that are somewhere between 80% and 60% off in sales, meaning people aren't moving, they're not signing contracts, they're rescinding contracts that we have. We have other contract or companies that are absolutely stable. The real question is not, in my mind at least, how difficult it will be for certain industries. It's how certain industries will react to the crisis. When things change, people have to react. And the truth is that within our own portfolio of companies, we had some managers who were not able to react in the way that was required months before this happened. They were having difficulty in trying to figure out how to manage the company or make decisions before. And so the crisis only highlighted. I've often said when people tend to drink a little bit too much, that all alcohol does is make you more of what you are. And so if somebody is a particularly poorly behaved person when they've had a few beers, that may be that they're probably a particularly poorly behaved person to begin with. And so companies that are under enormous duress now are companies that may have been challenged before. And forgive me, that doesn't lack empathy. I don't mean for it to lack empathy. I understand that there are individuals who are deeply troubled. And as I said, we've got companies that are down 80% or more, and there are others that are down 100%. But it's happened. And now the focus has to be on how do we adjust our business models in order to live in a new world.
Yeah,
What I've had in our own conversations on boards is it's no longer about the income side. Now it's about the expense side. How
yeah.
do we make that match to whatever income we're going to see?
Okay. Well, these are actually famous last words. Thank you very much, Terry. It all comes back. It all comes back to innovation and disruption. And I think it's a constant trial and error process, and it's the risk that entrepreneurs undertake. And without that, we would not be able to create growth and well-being for everybody. Without further ado, I would simply want to thank you again, Terry. Have a wonderful Mother's Day. Warm regards to Indianapolis, and stay tuned. We will see you very soon, hopefully live, when the roadshow runs live in Europe in fall. And I want to thank the Ayn Rand Center and the Romanian American University for hosting us and for partnering with us. I will come back in 20 minutes, or actually in 20 minutes past 4 Central European time, and 20 minutes Eastern time, with Martin Gundinger to discuss individual freedom and a couple of other hot issues and interesting questions that all relate to the current situation that everybody of us is in. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it equally as Terry and I did. Looking forward to seeing you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you.